Hey, Drew, thanks for that. Maria, thank you for the welcome. It's really great to be here today to talk at this seminar about safer skies and stronger clubs. I think both those are pretty important to us as glide pilots. What I kind of intend to do today is pretty much use the Air Force as a bit of an example of how your safety performance can improve over time. So I'm going to walk you through probably the last 45 years of the Air Force experience, and maybe we'll try and draw out some lessons for gliding clubs. And what I really want to do is actually highlight the importance of culture, because in my view, that's the heart of any organisational safety performance. Just give you a quick background for those that don't know me. I started gliding, I think, in my first logbook entry is 1975. I had been flying with cadets from 1972 onwards. Managed to win my first state championships in 1978 and placed in the top 10 at the 1979 Nationals, and have spent the last 45 years trying to get back to that level, which is always difficult. Joined the Air Force in 1980. Survived pilot's course, got posted to fly Chinooks, flew Iroquois for a little while as the introductory helicopter course, went on to instruct on Mackie jet trainers, was a member of the Roulettes as number 5, number 2, and led the last Mackie team, flew F-18s for about 10 years, and then in a really strange quirk, I did a board of inquiry on our last fatal F-111 accident, and the chief at the time said, well, you wrote all these recommendations, you go up and implement them, which was somewhat of a challenge at the time. So look, there's plenty, overall, 5,200 military hours, 3,000 hours in gliders. There's people that have been doing it longer in this room. There's probably better and more experienced pilots as well, but I think my experience is probably a little unique, and hopefully we'll share it as we go along. First of all, and I say this with some trepidation, the Air Force's last fatal accident was 26 years ago, and I really touch a lot of wood, and I don't often say that. That is pretty unique among the world's air forces, and I think it's a pretty unique record amongst most flying organisations. Now, that came on the back of a lot of peacetime losses. And I'll go through some of them. I intend to sort of pick out 3 particular accidents I'll talk through, and hopefully you'll get some idea of, the cultural aspects of that. But that record today, and I say this with some trepidation, the Roulettes are actually doing a performance at Canberra today, and there's no reason in the world that there could not be an accident today. But 26 years is a long time, 0 fatalities over nearly 1.5 million hours, basically. But it's built on a pretty unique airworthiness system that was put in place 30 years ago. It's built on a culture of open reporting, which is really important. And it's also built on, leaders who actually look for weak signals in the organisation. I just put that down as a foot stomper as we go through. I think if you're in a flying club, in any sort of flying organisation, and you're in a leadership position, you've got to look at what's going on in that club and really look for those weak signals if you want to pick up before you have a major accident. Okay, let's have a look. For those that don't believe me, I'll go back to World War II. During World War II in Bomber Command, we had 10,000 aircrew who flew with the RAF in the UK. 4,200 of them were lost over that period. They represented 2% of the enlistments in the whole Australian force structure. They represented 20% of the casualties. 460 Squadron, which is probably our most famous one, lost 1,000 aircrew, 188 aeroplanes. They lost the entire squadron 5 times. over a period of five years. 15% of those accidents were actually accidents. They weren't combat losses. So the culture at the time, as you can imagine, was to do the mission first, no matter what the obstacles. And I'd argue the Air Force actually kept that culture for quite a long time. And if you have a look at those graphs there, you know, we lost sort of 60 of 97 meteors. You know, some of those are combat losses. We lost 21 of 39 sea venoms, 42 of 116 mirages. I had a CO at a Hornet squadron that actually ejected out of a mirage twice. You know, so losing aeroplanes, you know, and 38 of 97 Mackies, which is our primary trailer. We actually ordered the Hornet. We ordered 75 of them. 15 were attrition spares in that buy. They thought they were going to lose less aeroplanes because it had two engines. And for the first 4 or 5 years, we lost one Hornet a year. So, you know, that was the Air Force that I joined in 1980 as, you know, bulletproof legend in my own mind. I had no idea what those statistics were, and probably even if I did, I wouldn't have cared because what I wanted to do was fly aeroplanes. So, you know, in my first year, there's the kind of accident rate that starts from 1980. We lost 9 aircraft across the Australian Defence Force. In my second year, while I was still on pilot's course, we lost 6 aircraft and 4 fatalities in that year. In general, my first 10 years, I went to probably 2 mates' funerals a year in it. In that entire time, I lost 2 mates due to a car accident and 1 due to a gliding accident. So you can see during that 10-year period, it was not the safest occupation in the world. Let's take a closer look at 3 of them, because I think this was an accident in 1983, and I'll pull this out because I just left the squadron at this stage when this one happened. And it was a Chinook impacting a set of wires just short of a dam. Now again, the culture was mission first. You know, we could go to war tomorrow. We practiced, we flew at 150 feet. We were authorised at 150 feet. And guess what? You know, if you're at 150 feet, there's wires come to play, especially in river valleys. And you want to use river valleys because that's a good tactical thing. Here's a personal thing that I reflect on. I had 3 near misses with wires during my 2 or 3 years on Chinooks. It took me, and I suppose at the end of those 3 near misses, and I can actually still describe everyone, so you can actually see that they were pretty significant. I decided that flying down river valleys and rivers was not a good idea, and decided that I'd fly along the banks first to have a look for wires before I decided to do this tactical thing. We used to put in a lot of air incident messages in those days. Not one of those times did I ever put in an air incident message on any of those near misses. We used to put them in for technical issues, you know, chip lights in gearboxes and things like that. And I kind of reflect, the guy who unfortunately got killed in this was an RAF exchange. He'd done a tour in the Falklands War. He's quite a good pilot, you know. But I think we're actually slow to perceive risk, or the risks that we actually take sometimes. I just put that one up as an example. It took me 3 times, 3 close shaves before I decided that what I was doing was not a good idea. I think many of you know in this room, David Peach. If you go to Amberley, there's a Sabre there that's got quite a few markings for a wire strike that he had at 500 knots. It hit the intake, it went across, cracked the canopy, scraped across his helmet, finally broke when it hit the fin, and he was lucky to get away with it. It's a good story if you ever get him in the room to talk about it. The second one's a roulette collision that occurred in 1988. I think many of you have actually heard me talk about this maybe at competitions at different times. We were practicing for Expo 1988, and I think most of the people in this room are old enough to remember that. It was a kind of big deal. we had Current Affair there that was going to do a story on the roulettes, and they wanted some pictures. We had a choice, rudimentary risk management at the time. I had been in the team longer than roulette. I was in 5, so we needed to put the cameras on the outside of the formation. I'd been in the team about longer than number 4, so that was the risk management criteria. I remember sort of looking at, as we hooked up the camera in the back seat, and of course there were no GoPros in that day, so you can imagine the recorder was quite large, the camera was quite large, and I'm looking at the sort of, the wires in the back seat and starting to think about the ejection and thinking, maybe this doesn't look good if he's got to get out. So he was actually in the back seat. So all these photographs, and if you want to have a look at the video, Mackie crash, 1988 Mackie crash, you can actually see it in full view. But I do remember the brief I gave cameraman Shane Dyson, who was sitting in the back. We'd had the main formation brief where we did mention the possibility of swapping paint, which was our sort of thing for having a collision. The only thing I was worried about was between 120 knots and 180 knots. I said to him, you're going to have to pull that handle, because if I have an engine failure, I can't do a turn back to the runway. From 120, I could take the barrier. From 180, I could make a turn back. Not at any time did I mention the possibility of a collision, even though we were in close formation. It was not really on my radar as a possibility. We were the roulettes, didn't happen to us, we had all this under control. So on that day, we got through about halfway through the display, and the display involved a snake or caterpillar loop where we were all in line astern at 500 feet. Each one would do an individual loop, relatively benign and easy manoeuvre, and then we'd actually join back up into a box or diamond formation. What happened was that number 4, who was in the slot position right at the back, he overshot the lead. He called in, the lead started to do a wing over back to get his line correct. And the mechanics of it were that as he overshot, of course he's looking back behind him like that, and what tends to happen is the stick follows the hand, the hand follows the head largely, and that's fundamentally how that happened. I rapidly, if you look at the video, I rapidly turned towards New Zealand to get out of the fray. A little bit of shock there for a while and thinking, somebody better make a radio call. I hear 2 comes up with a mayday call. So that's good, that's his responsibility. So my responsibility from there was to convince the cameraman that he could never use that footage again, because that'd be required for the inquiry. I had a shock cameraman, he was quite convinced of that. And of course the Air Force released the footage on the Daily News that night. The cameraman got a Wakely Award for just being shit scared in my back seat. But anyway. But there's a little bit more to this story, and I just want to point out that, accidents, if you took that at face value, that was very much a human error accident. One of the guys made a mistake. But there was more of a backstory, an organisational backstory to this particular incident. At that time, it was the late 1980s, the Air Force had a really big drain of pilots, experienced pilots to the airlines. Again, the mission always gets done. We're at Central Flying School, we're teaching people how to be instructors. So we started to take some Army pilots in. Roulette 4 was an ex-Army pilot. And we'd give them a shortened wings course. But that shortened wings course did not give them anywhere near the amount of formation flying that we'd done on pilot's course or the rejoin aspects of it. Roulette 4 could actually, he was a pretty reasonable pilot, he could fly formation. But we all knew that he actually had an issue with rejoins. But let me just go to the culture. The culture of the time was, you just needed to sort these things out yourself. And in fact, it was even a bit worse than that. On high-level transits, some of us would actually just adjust the throttle, so we'd actually deliberately make him overshoot to actually point out that he really didn't have this under control. At no time did any of us in that formation decide that maybe we should take him up and fix this issue. It was just an issue that he had to fix himself. It sounds strange now, but that was the environment we were in. The other thing we did is this guy had probably 250 hours on the Mackie. We all had about 1,500, close to 1,500 hours. At Central Flying School, you used to teach on the CT4 and teach on the Mackie, so you teach on two. So he's flying the roulettes on the Mackie, he's teaching on the CT4, and he volunteered to do the conversion course on the PC9 as we were bringing it in. If you can get a loaded gun and put it to somebody's head, that's pretty much what we did in that particular case. Next one. Let's have another look. My next one is a little closer to home and probably the most critical and the one that Air Force decided to change. That probably, change what we did. This was a 707 accident in the early 90s. And the captain on this one was pretty close to home. The captain was my best man at my wedding. I used to go to his family while I was on pilot's course, so I knew him particularly well. He was a really good pilot. He was a better pilot than I was. But he'd been a captain on P3s before. Again, high loss rate within the Air Force. We were losing people out of the 707s. He got posted into East Sale to do an instructor's course. He then got posted to 707s. He had a very short operational tour on 707s and then became the instructor. Now, on the 707, we didn't actually have a lot of documentation on training procedures. So he developed a VMCA demonstration that basically replicated what he did in P3s. Now, P3s flew all around the world, 200 feet with two engines out a lot of the time because, they were saving fuel. So this was not unusual from his point of view. The trouble was that, in a swept-wing aeroplane, when you take one engine out and you start to run out of rudder authority, it behaves quite differently to a swept-wing aeroplane. But we didn't have a lot of documentation on training on the 707. So, unfortunately, he devised a manoeuvre that was inherently dangerous, and we lost that aeroplane and five crew. So I suppose, there's just three accidents, just give you a feel of the culture in the outfit. The culture was very much, you did the job. And you did the job no matter what the obstacles, because, that's what they did in World War II. And it's not surprising that we actually dragged that culture right through until the end of the 90s, because the leadership up until 1980 was still a pretty much ex-World War II leadership. So let's have a look at what the Air Force did. And I think this is probably, the Gliding Federation's already drawn a lot of these lessons. They certainly put in place a much more robust technical airworthiness stream. It had been there before, but it certainly got a lot more robust. Probably more importantly, they put in an operational airworthiness system, which a lot of the times in aviation we concentrate on the technical things that are going wrong with the aeroplane. Now, Pawn is a classic example that we've got within the GFA at the moment. So much focus on the technical fatigue aspects of that aeroplane, yet we don't look at the overall operational effect of losing half the fleet of tugs and what it actually does to the operation. So very much there was a big focus on this. We rearranged the aeroplanes into different force element groups. So the fighters were in one group, the maritime was in another group, the bombers were in another group. So the leadership had deep experience, deep operational experience. But the real secret of some of the things we did was we created an airworthiness board system, which I don't think, even though a lot of air forces have looked at this airworthiness system we put together, many of them didn't actually replicate this particular aspect. Now, what it involved was a couple of senior retired officers, one an operator, one an engineer or logistician. Each year, each one of those force element groups had to do an airworthiness pack where they actually look back through all the incidents, maintenance incidents, aircraft incidents, what had happened over the 12 months. There'd be an extensive sort of report that you, if you were the group commander, would have to put together. You'd have one day in there with these old greybeards, and they'd ask pretty probing questions. There'd be a representation of all the COs of the squadrons, all the senior airmen, everybody that was actually involved in the system would be sitting in that particular room for that day. And these guys would use their sort of accumulated wisdom to sort of pick into their overall system and see how it went. There were a lot of pretty open and honest conversations, and of course they'd write the report at the end of it that would go up through the system. But the most important thing was that at the end of the day, they'd go straight to the chief and give a verbal download on what they'd seen within each one of those force element groups. Now, when you're sitting there as the chief and you get this, hey, your C-130s are running on this risk profile because of this and a few other bits and pieces, you've actually got no excuse not to do something about it. And I think over, the 20-odd years that I observed this process, I think it saved us probably a C-130 and a P3 over the years because of that particular process where, we decided, I think in a case when we started the Middle East operations in the C-130 and P3, there was a lot of strain because of the rotation of people. I think we ended up putting an extra 80 people in each one of those force element groups just so that it could operate normally. So the other thing we did, and I'll go back, we sort of introduced a pretty rudimentary risk management system in the early 90s. I say rudimentary, but in many respects, I still think it was not a bad way to do it. At the end of the week, we'd actually sit down, the executives within each of the squadrons, they'd look at what the program is for next week, the following week. And they'd just look at where we'd had problems before, what our risk mitigations were, what sort of briefings we were going to get, and do it all up on a whiteboard. Now, this is transformed with ISO 9000 into beautiful Excel spreadsheets and heat maps and things like that. I remain a little unconvinced that the whiteboard technique isn't a better technique in some ways to do risk management, because risk management should be a living, breathing thing that you look at all the time and, look at whether your mitigations are still in place, whether your risks have changed and things like that. But again, that was pretty successful. Didn't guarantee, success. I remember sitting in the mess with some visitors one day and got a tap on the shoulder and had to go back and review the tapes of two of my squadron guys at the time who'd managed to sort of, TV1 ACM had managed to go so close that they'd actually put the fins of the two Hornets in between each other on a particular pass at the time. One of the guys had not called blind. One of them had, actually two people, Matty Hall, I think many of you probably know about, and one of the other guys. They were both pretty similar sort of experience. One of them didn't call blind as Matty pulled them into the sun. He spun around and they just came through like that. So, sometimes a bit of luck has been involved in this 26 years of no fatalities. But I suppose what I really want to highlight here is the importance of culture And to me, it's really at the heart of the whole thing. You know, as a leadership team in your clubs or whatever, you've got to have a commitment that you know, yep, we're going to go on fly gliders, but in the end, you know, safety's got to be surrounding and important. And I'll go back to why I think culture is important. If you look at this graph, I'll draw a distinction between Army and Air Force aviation. If you have a look at that curve, especially post, 2000, or probably even post 2000. Air Force's last fatality was in 1999. Army aviation has continued at pretty much the same accident rate. Now, it has exactly the same infrastructure from airworthiness boards, technical, operational airworthiness oversight. There is one difference, and I'm not going to actually talk about exactly what those differences are in this forum, but there is a definite difference in culture between the two flying organisations. And that's why I say, that's why I say, in my mind, it's very much at the heart of safety. If you look at that graph, all Air Force's losses, and we have lost, Caribou, a PC-9, and a Growler, but they've all been technical issues, 2 engine failures, and I don't recall the Caribou. So we think about that, what is a good safety culture? I think it's really open incident reporting, and I'll talk about that a little later. You've actually got to learn from your mistakes. You've actually got to bring safety to the front of everybody's mind. I've noticed a characteristic in flying competitions lately where, we look at everybody and we say, you're experienced. Well, yeah, we're all experienced, but we all need reminders of, the sort of risks that we're facing and what we should do up there, and a leadership commitment. I'll give you a personal insight. I've survived, touch wood, 8,000 hours. And I've survived it by not fully trusting myself. So what do I mean by that? There's a really good line in Tony Kern's book, Redefining Airmanship. Anybody read it here? Or quite a few people might have read it. It's a great book. It's a book that I wish I'd written. When it first came out, I distributed to every pilot I had in the squadron. And if I'm trying to encourage young pilots, I'll usually buy a copy and give them a copy. That's what I think about. And it's one of the good lines is, aviation is an error-intolerant profession, constantly challenged by its most important but error-prone component, us. So, we all make errors. It's just the nature of being a human being. We're not great judges of our own capability. If you do any sort of survey, most of the time, 80% of people think they're in the top 20%. Probably applies to gliding as well. We're just poor judges of our own capability. So let me give you a couple of personal examples. So when I say I don't fully trust myself, if I'm actually, we're in trouble for time here, Drew, or not? Getting close. Okay. In the Hornet, we used to have a whole lot of checks, right? And I'd get to the end of the runway, and I'd just do another series of checks, which were my own. I'd check the canopy was closed. I'd check the ejection seat was armed. I'd check the flap was at half, and the trims were at 12 degrees. Anything else that I hadn't switched on or done didn't really matter, because I was actually going to get airborne. The Hornet wouldn't get airborne if you didn't have the flaps at half and you didn't have trim at 12 degrees, it just charged down the runway. Landing. Let me give you another example. After the flight, there was only one critical safety factor involved, is that I'd actually safed the ejection seat. Every other switch could have been on. Didn't really matter. I didn't need to have turned off anything. The number of times I walked up and down that ladder to check that I'd actually safed that seat, I'd like $1 for every time I do that. I do a similar thing in the gliders as well. There's a couple of critical actions. I sit there, even though I've done the chaotic check, I check the canopy's closed, I pull against the harness, I check the air brakes locked. Everything else really doesn't matter. On landing, I'll probably check that the gear's down twice. Now, some people are more precise. I've just found that, over the years, there's times where I've forgotten to body arm ejection seats. There's times where I've forgotten to actually lock brakes on things. So, some actions are more critical than others. And you've got to be careful, not all checks are equal. And I sometimes, I sit in the tug some days and I sometimes wonder whether we've actually got our priorities right when we're sitting in the thing. The ABCD check has now seemed to have turned into some sort of another daily inspection. I look at it and go, you flew this thing 5 minutes ago, walk around it, has it got any grass in the ailerons or whatever? Hop in, it's a pretty simple thing, close the canopy, lock the harness, close the air brakes, you should be able to go flying. It shouldn't take you the same time that it used to take me to taxi an F-111 to actually get flying in a glider. So, sorry, slight frustration vent there as a tug pilot. But listen, back to the gliding movement, and I think it's great today that we've got. Actually, I probably should have moved some of these slides on. I think we've got to look at the gliding movement. It's great today that we're actually looking at stronger clubs. We are under real risk at the moment. Pawnee, COVID, ageing volunteer base, of still trying to do the same things that we always do. You've just got to look at your resource base sometimes and go, well, hey, this is all we've got. So this is what we can do. Drew, how much time have I got?
13.
13 minutes? Okay. The other thing is a good reporting culture. Now, I've seen really good and bad examples of this within the gliding movement, but in my mind, it's critical because if you get, and it's not only just a reporting culture, it's the ability to disseminate the reporting, the incident in particular, because everybody else's accident or incident is actually a free lesson for you. It's one you haven't had to learn, and that's the attitude you should take. I saw a really good example up at Darling Downs. There was an outlanding incident in Jantar. Aidan, I think you're here somewhere. I went out and helped de-rig it. Now, Aidan had gone into a paddock with stubble. He'd actually picked the tracks to land in, and until I'd actually gone out and looked at this Jantar, I may have made a similar sort of decision to actually land where he landed. Unfortunately, by landing in the tracks, it lowered it enough that the glider was subject to the stubble, and of course he went round and did a ground loop. Now in a ground loop, you're not going to go straight, you go sideways, and of course it went sideways, it went over the track and bent the undercarriage. So, that was discussed at the time at the club. But what I thought was really good was a very similar incident occurred at Lake Keepit that same week. It came out in a video. I think Doug sent it out in a video. Jenny at the Darling Downs Soaring Club sent it out on the chat, which is a sort of push mechanism. And so we had the video, we'd had the other incident. There was a whole lot of good discussion that went on there by the Brains Trust of the Darling Downs Soaring Club about, hey, ploughed paddocks are preferred. Don't land on the tractor tracks. There was even somebody even posted a picture of good landing another aeroplane. So there was a whole lot of good learning aspects taken out of that. I have seen, other instances where there's been incidents at a club, and there's been very little information filtered out. The problem with that is it probably only went to 80 people. That particular outlanding incident needs to go to the entire gliding association. Because what's happened is farming practices have changed over the last 20 odd years. There's no longer lots of big ploughed paddocks. There's a lot of zero-till paddocks. The stubble is no longer shin high. So the actual risk profile of going into a paddock has actually increased a fair bit. I'm not sure as a movement we've sort of flagged that enough and maybe put it out to the membership that we need to be particularly careful about that. So I think, that's something you can work on. I think the training system, like I said, I think a lot of the aspects of that airworthiness foundation is in place thanks to a lot of great work within a volunteer organisation. We've got the technical side of it pretty well covered most of the time thanks to a hard-working volunteer team. The syllabus is not bad. I went flying with a few of the cadets. Maybe they gave me all the best cadets, but they were very impressive to fly with. They really were. So, I think we've got all the basics there to actually, address or decrease our accident and incident rate. We just need to culturally have a look at a few issues. On that, there's probably one other one that I'll just flag that I think we all need to be careful of. Gliding attracts self-made people, very successful in their particular operations on the ground. Sometimes, and I emphasise it's only sometimes, my observation is that they take that success, the confidence they've got from that success into the air. Gliding training is good, but it doesn't cover everything about aviation. And I sometimes think that a lot of people get airborne there. They really don't know what they don't know. They are excessively confident in their ability, which I don't think they should be. So what do you need in the end? I've talked about that. Disciplined, humble pilots is a nice way to put it. Strong training systems and a pretty active safety culture. I don't know, Drew, we got any time for questions or not?
Yeah, 5.
Stunned silence.
Questions from the road?
Yeah, just a quick one. So in my personal view of authorisation is that it doesn't exist in gliding predominantly. It's how to work. What's your view on that? Should we look at that formal in that regard?
Yeah, look, I'm kind of I'm very conscious that, gliding isn't the Air Force in some respects. I know where you're getting at because you're actually having a look at, whether a person's qualified in the right sort of frame of mind to do something. I think you can still do it, through your duty instructor role at a gliding club. I'm just a bit wary of adding any extra bureaucracy to the way we operate, because if anything, we need to cut it down so we can actually make it easier to fly. But I think it's a good discussion point. There's reasons maybe to do it. Drew, I think I'm off the hook.
Hey, thank you.
Okay.